In the twilight halls of Constantinople, where knowledge was currency and wisdom commanded armies of influence, there lived a truth more precious than Byzantine gold. A man's reputation is the invisible throne upon which his real power rests. For in a world where empires could crumble overnight and fortunes could vanish with the morning mist, the one treasure that could rebuild kingdoms was the trust earned through decades of careful cultivation and the respect that survived even when everything else was lost. The year was 1081, and the Byzantine Empire trembled on the edge of chaos. The Seljuk Turks pressed against the eastern borders while Norman armies threatened from the west. But perhaps the greatest danger came from within. A crisis of knowledge that threatened to plunge the civilized world into darkness. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, where the accumulated wisdom of ages was preserved in manuscripts more valuable than jewels, one man understood that reputation was not merely a luxury for the successful, but the very foundation upon which success itself must be built. Master Georgios Chrysokokes stood before the great window of the imperial library, watching the morning sun illuminate the city that had been the beacon of learning for 7 centuries. At 35, he held the position of chief librarian and scholar to the Byzantine court, responsible for maintaining the vast collection of texts that represented humanity's greatest intellectual achievements: Greek philosophy, Roman law, mathematical treatises, medical knowledge, theological works, and chronicles of history. All of it rested under his care like sleeping dragons of wisdom waiting to be awakened. But Georgios carried a burden that few in the empire understood. He was not merely the guardian of existing knowledge, but the architect of its future. For years, he had been secretly working on a project that would either secure his place among history's greatest scholars or destroy everything he had spent his life building. The difference would depend entirely on something as fragile as morning dew and twice as precious: his reputation. The crisis had begun 18 months earlier, when a series of devastating fires had swept through libraries across the empire. Alexandria, Thessalonica, Nicaea, one by one, irreplaceable collections of manuscripts had been reduced to ash and memory. Each loss represented not just books destroyed, but knowledge that could never be recovered. Wisdom that had been passed down through generations only to vanish in a single night of flames. The scholarly community throughout the Byzantine world had watched in horror as centuries of learning disappeared forever. Desperate attempts to save what remained had led to a frantic copying campaign, with scribes working day and night to duplicate the most important texts before they too might be lost. But manuscript copying was painstakingly slow work, requiring not just careful penmanship, but deep understanding of the subjects being preserved. More troubling still were the rumors that not all of these fires had been accidental. Reports suggested that enemies of the empire had deliberately targeted libraries and schools, understanding that destroying Byzantine intellectual superiority was as valuable as any military victory. Knowledge, after all, was the secret weapon that had allowed the empire to survive for 8 centuries, while barbarian kingdoms rose and fell like waves upon the shore. In this atmosphere of crisis and suspicion, Georgios had conceived an idea so audacious that he had shared it with no one. He would create not just copies of existing works, but an entirely new type of manuscript that would preserve knowledge in a way that made it virtually indestructible. His vision was a comprehensive encyclopedia that would contain the essential elements of all human learning, written in a coded system that could be deciphered by future scholars even if the traditional methods of education were lost. The project was staggering in scope. It would require not just copying existing texts, but analyzing synthesizing, and restructuring knowledge from hundreds of different sources. Mathematics would be integrated with philosophy, medicine combined with natural history, theology balanced with practical governance. The result would be a single work that could, if necessary, serve as the foundation for rebuilding civilization itself. But such an undertaking carried risks that went far beyond the technical challenges of the work itself. In the conservative world of Byzantine scholarship, innovation was often viewed with suspicion. Scholars who deviated too far from established traditions risked being accused of heresy, arrogance, or dangerous experimentation. The intellectual elite of Constantinople were fiercely protective of their reputations, and they had little tolerance for colleagues whose ambitions might make them appear inadequate by comparison. Georgios understood that revealing his project too early could invite attacks from jealous rivals, religious authorities concerned about theological implications, or imperial officials worried about the political ramifications of concentrating so much knowledge in a single work. If he moved too quickly or spoke too boldly about his vision, he could find his reputation destroyed before his work was complete, making it impossible to finish what he had started. Yet, if he waited too long, continued manuscript losses might make his work irrelevant, or other scholars might develop similar projects that would diminish the uniqueness of his contribution. The balance between secrecy and revelation, between patience and urgency, would determine not just the success of his encyclopedia, but the trajectory of his entire career. The delicate nature of this balance became clear when Georgios received an unexpected visit from Father Maximos Planudes, one of the most influential theological scholars in the empire. The elderly monk had devoted his life to preserving Orthodox doctrine and had developed a reputation for identifying and neutralizing intellectual threats to religious orthodoxy. His presence in the imperial library was rarely a social call. "Master Georgios," Father Maximos began, settling his aged frame into the chair across from the chief librarian's desk. "I have been hearing fascinating rumors about your recent activities. Some say you have been working on a project of unusual scope and ambition." The words were delivered with the casual tone that experienced courtiers used when discussing matters of life and death importance. Georgios recognized the careful phrasing that invited confession while offering no protection for what might be revealed. "I am always working on multiple projects, Father," Georgios replied with equal care. "The preservation of our intellectual heritage requires constant attention to many different areas of scholarship." "Indeed," the monk nodded approvingly. "And it is precisely this devotion to preservation that has earned you such respect throughout the scholarly community. Your reputation for careful, orthodox scholarship is one of the treasures of our empire." The emphasis on orthodox was not accidental. In the complex world of Byzantine politics, theological orthodoxy was not just a matter of religious belief, but a requirement for professional survival. Scholars who were perceived as straying from established doctrine could find themselves not just professionally ruined, but physically endangered. "I am honored by such confidence," Georgios said, understanding that this was both a compliment and a warning. "Which is why," Father Maximos continued, "I wanted to discuss with you personally some concerns that have been raised about certain innovations that may be emerging in our scholarly community. There are those who worry that the current crisis has led some of our colleagues to pursue projects that, while well-intentioned, might inadvertently challenge established wisdom or create confusion among less experienced scholars." The conversation continued for another hour, with both men dancing around the central issue like diplomats negotiating a treaty. Father Maximos never directly accused Georgios of anything, nor did he explicitly threaten consequences for any particular course of action. Instead, he painted a picture of a scholarly community under pressure, where reputations built over decades could be destroyed by a single misstep, and where the appearance of innovation could be as dangerous as actual heresy. For his part, Georgios revealed nothing about his encyclopedia project, while demonstrating his continued commitment to orthodox scholarship and traditional methods. He showed Father Maximos several conventional copying projects, discussed his efforts to preserve threatened manuscripts, and emphasized his deep respect for established authorities and time-tested approaches to learning. By the time the monk departed, both men understood perfectly what had been communicated. Georgios now knew that his project was being watched, that influential figures in the religious hierarchy were prepared to act against scholars who appeared to be stepping outside acceptable boundaries. But he also understood that his reputation for conservative, reliable scholarship had provided him with a degree of protection that more flamboyant colleagues might not enjoy. Most importantly, he realized that his reputation was not just an asset to be preserved, but a strategic tool that could be deliberately employed to achieve his larger goals. Over the following months, Georgios embarked on what appeared to be a campaign of excessive caution. He began seeking formal approval for even routine copying projects, consulting with religious authorities about theological implications of preserving certain texts, and organizing public discussions where senior scholars could review and approve his work before it was completed. To observers, this newfound deference looked like the behavior of a man who had been chastened by authority, someone who was so concerned about protecting his reputation that he had become almost paralyzingly careful. Some younger scholars privately criticized what they saw as unnecessary conservatism, while more experienced colleagues approved of his respectful approach to established procedures. What none of them realized was that this visible display of orthodox behavior was providing Georgios with perfect cover for his revolutionary project. While everyone could see his careful attention to traditional scholarship, no one thought to look for the innovative work he was conducting in the privacy of his personal study. His reputation for conventional thinking had become a cloak of invisibility that allowed him to pursue unconventional goals without detection. The strategy required extraordinary discipline. During the day, Georgios would conduct his official duties with meticulous attention to established procedures, consulting widely, documenting everything, and ensuring that his every action reinforced his image as a scholar who valued reputation above innovation. But during the long hours after midnight, when the library was empty and the city slept, he would work on his encyclopedia with the focused intensity of a man trying to save civilization itself. The contrast between his public and private work was remarkable. His official projects involved careful copying of traditional texts using established methods, with every decision reviewed by committees and every change documented for posterity. His secret project involved revolutionary approaches to organizing knowledge, experimental methods of preserving information, and innovations that challenged fundamental assumptions about how scholarship should be conducted. Yet both aspects of his work were guided by the same strategic principle. His reputation was not just something to be protected, but something to be actively constructed and deployed in service of his larger goals. Every public display of orthodox behavior added to his credibility, making it less likely that anyone would suspect him of the radical innovations he was pursuing in private. The first test of this strategy came when Master Constantine Lascaris, the empire's most renowned philosopher, announced his own project to create a comprehensive guide to Greek learning. Lascaris was everything Georgios was not. Brilliant, charismatic, politically connected, and supremely confident in his own abilities. His reputation was based not on careful orthodoxy, but on intellectual boldness and innovative thinking. when Lascaris publicly described his vision for synthesizing classical knowledge into a new form of scholarship. The reaction was immediate and intense. Religious authorities questioned the theological implications of his approach. Traditional scholars worried about the abandonment of established methods, and political figures concerned themselves with the potential for his work to challenge existing power structures. Within weeks, Lascaris found himself defending not just his project, but his entire approach to scholarship. Critics who had once praised his innovative thinking now accused him of dangerous radicalism. Former allies distanced themselves from his work, and institutional support for his project began to evaporate like morning mist. Georgios watched this destruction with a mixture of sympathy and strategic calculation. Lascaris was attempting to accomplish something similar to his own secret project, but the philosopher had chosen to build his reputation on innovation rather than orthodoxy. When the inevitable opposition emerged, Lascaris had no protective reputation to fall back on. Indeed, his reputation for radical thinking actually intensified the attacks against him. The lesson was clear. In a conservative environment, reputation for orthodoxy was not just valuable, but essential for anyone attempting to pursue truly innovative work. Lascaris had tried to be openly revolutionary and had been destroyed by the very community he hoped to serve. But a scholar who appeared to be utterly conventional might be able to accomplish revolutionary goals precisely because no one would expect such work from someone with such a traditional reputation. As Lascaris's project collapsed and his reputation lay in ruins, Georgios quietly accelerated his own work. The fate of his colleague had provided him with valuable intelligence about the limits of acceptable innovation and the methods his opponents would use to destroy threatening projects. But it had also created an opportunity. With Lascaris neutralized, there was less competition for the kind of comprehensive encyclopedia project that Georgios was secretly developing. The breakthrough came in the project's second year, when Georgios discovered a method for encoding knowledge that solved the fundamental problem he'd been wrestling with since the beginning. Traditional manuscripts were vulnerable not just to fire and decay, but to misinterpretation by future readers who might lack the cultural context necessary to understand complex ideas. His encoding system would embed multiple layers of meaning within apparently simple text, ensuring that essential knowledge could be preserved, even if the sophisticated scholarly tradition that had created it was temporarily lost. But implementing this system required resources that went far beyond what he could access through his official position. He would need teams of specialized scribes, rare materials for creating durable manuscripts, and most critically, the cooperation of scholars throughout the empire who possessed knowledge in specialized fields that needed to be included in the encyclopedia. This meant that the time for complete secrecy was coming to an end. Soon, he would need to reveal his project, seek support from institutional authorities, and convince the scholarly community that his work represented not dangerous innovation, but essential preservation. The success of this transition would depend entirely on the reputation he had been so carefully constructing. The revelation came not through a dramatic announcement, but through a carefully orchestrated series of private consultations. Georgios began by approaching individual scholars whose expertise he needed for specific sections of the encyclopedia, presenting his requests not as part of a revolutionary project, but as extensions of his well-known work in preserving traditional knowledge. To the theologian whose help he needed with religious texts, he presented his work as an effort to preserve orthodox doctrine against future threats. To the mathematician whose knowledge was essential for technical sections, he described his project as a method for ensuring that classical mathematical knowledge would survive potential future disasters. To the historian whose chronologies were crucial for contextualizing other material, He explained his work as an attempt to create a more secure record of Byzantine achievements. Each scholar was shown only the portions of the encyclopedia that related to their own expertise, and each was asked to contribute based on their established professional relationships with Georgios rather than their enthusiasm for innovation. Because Georgios' reputation for orthodox scholarship was so well established, none of his collaborators questioned whether his project might involve methods or goals that diverged from traditional approaches. The strategy worked perfectly. One by one, the empire's leading scholars contributed their knowledge to Georgios' encyclopedia, each believing they were participating in a conventional preservation project led by one of their most trusted colleagues. The scope and revolutionary nature of the overall work remained invisible to everyone except Georgios himself. But the most critical test of his reputation came when he finally needed to approach the imperial authorities for official support. Creating and preserving the encyclopedia would require resources that only the imperial treasury could provide, and imperial backing would be essential for ensuring that the finished work would be properly protected and distributed. The meeting took place in the same chamber where Constantine Lascaris had been destroyed just months earlier. Georgios presented his work to a council that included not just government officials, but religious authorities and senior scholars, many of whom had been directly involved in the campaign against his predecessor's project. But where Lascaris had spoken of innovation and revolutionary approaches to learning, Georgios emphasized preservation and orthodox methods. Where the philosopher had challenged traditional approaches, the librarian demonstrated his deep respect for established procedures. Most importantly, where Lascaris had built his case on his reputation for radical thinking, Georgios built his on a reputation for careful, conservative scholarship that had never led the empire astray. The difference in reception was remarkable. The same authorities who had viewed Lascaris' project as a dangerous threat embraced Georgios' work as an essential defense against future disasters. They saw not a revolutionary challenging established knowledge, but a trusted guardian working to preserve it through uncertain times. The imperial approval came with resources that exceeded even Georgios' most optimistic projections. Teams of scribes, access to the finest materials, cooperation from monasteries and libraries throughout the empire, and most significantly, official protection for the project and its creator. The emperor himself issued a decree declaring the encyclopedia to be a priority of the highest importance for imperial security. Over the following 3 years, Georgios oversaw the completion of what would later be recognized as one of the greatest intellectual achievements in human history. His encyclopedia preserved not just the content of classical learning, but innovative methods for organizing and accessing knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. The encoding systems he developed ensured that the essential elements of Byzantine civilization would survive even if the empire itself fell to barbarian conquest. But perhaps more remarkably, he achieved this revolutionary accomplishment while not just preserving, but actually enhancing his reputation for orthodox scholarship. When the completed encyclopedia was finally revealed to the scholarly community, it was praised not as a radical innovation, but as the natural culmination of traditional preservation methods applied with unprecedented skill and dedication. Years later, when Constantinople did fall to Ottoman forces and much of the Byzantine intellectual tradition was scattered to the winds, Georgios' encyclopedia became one of the primary sources through which classical knowledge was preserved and transmitted to future generations. Scholars throughout Europe would study his work, unaware that the apparently traditional methods they were examining actually contained revolutionary innovations that had been deliberately camouflaged by their creator's reputation for conservative thinking. When young scholars would ask the elderly Georgios about the secret of his success, He would tell them about the importance of patience, preparation, and most critically, the wisdom of building a reputation that could survive any storm. Your reputation, he would say, is like the foundation of a great building. If it is solid and deep, you can construct anything upon it. But if it is weak or poorly built, even the most beautiful structure will collapse when the winds begin to blow. In our modern world of instant communication and viral fame, this ancient wisdom might seem outdated. We live in an age where reputation can be built or destroyed in a matter of hours, where the social media presence often matters more than actual accomplishment, and where the loudest voices are sometimes mistaken for the most credible. But the principle that guided Georgios remains as relevant today as it was in the marble halls of Byzantium. In any competitive field, long-term success depends not just on talent or innovation, but on the careful cultivation of a reputation that can withstand both success and failure, both praise and criticism. The most successful professionals, entrepreneurs, and leaders understand that reputation is not just the result of their work, but a strategic asset that must be deliberately built and carefully maintained. They know that while skills can be learned and knowledge can be acquired, trust must be earned through consistent demonstration of reliability, integrity, and competence over time. This doesn't mean being false or manipulative, but rather understanding that perception shapes reality, that credibility enables capability, and that in a world where everyone claims to be an expert, the person whose reputation speaks for itself will find that others listen when they finally choose to speak. The lesson is not to become obsessed with reputation at the expense of substance, but to recognize that substance without reputation is like a magnificent palace built in a location where no one will ever see it. True success requires both the ability to do exceptional work and the wisdom to ensure that when the work is complete, there will be people ready to recognize its value and support its impact. For in the end, reputation is not about what others think of you in any given moment, but about the accumulated trust they have in your judgment, your capabilities, and your character when the stakes are highest and the pressure is greatest. And that kind of trust, once earned and carefully maintained, becomes the most valuable currency in any age.